Okay, hello everyone. Today our case study is France, and we will talk a bit about the political system of France, the historical evolution of the French state, its political culture, its political institutions, and other specific characteristics of France that we need to know. In the beginning, I wrote this expression, end of French exceptionalism. Can we talk about an end of French exceptionalism? What I meant was that all countries in the world have their own specificities, have their own peculiarities, have their identities which may be different from other countries and which they want to also retain, they want to also keep as maybe an instance of tradition, also as an important marker of their separate existence and identity. So these identity politics is also quite important, of course, when we talk about states and nations. In the case of France, usually again in books about the French political system, its history, its state, we also hear references to exceptionalism, French exceptionalism, that France has always defined itself as a very specific, very peculiar country, different from other countries, and as much as possible, it resisted attempts maybe to change, to adapt to global developments. But can we really say that? Can we really say that France is different from other countries because it is under the same sort of pressures from globalization, from European integration, and it needs to adapt to the, let's say, to the needs of the current era. It has in both in economic policy, in politics, etc. So can we still say that France is different and it is retaining this difference, this peculiar identity? So this is maybe a question that we can have at the back of our minds while studying France. Firstly, this is again a let's say a conglomeration of different motifs and symbols which remind us about France. Of course, here we have the map and the flag, the tricolor, let's say, consisting of these three colors. We have also the motto, let's say, of the French Revolution, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which was a motto of the revolutionaries that actually revolted against the monarchy in the French Revolution. Then we have the rooster. The rooster is also seen as again a symbol, maybe non-official symbol of France. The Gallic, let's say, rooster. And we have Marianne also. Marianne is a female figure who has been recognized as the embodiment of France. So a female character symbolizing the unity of France. This is also quite important in terms of the political culture and the unity, symbolizing the unity of France. We can say that France is one of the major states of the world because of its early nation building process. It has been one of the earliest states, centralized states that evolved in the world, and it has also been able to expand and influence the world, both Europe and also other continents, through the cultural influences, through the political systems, ideas, and institutions. Many of the ideas of the Enlightenment period emerged from France and then they were taken up by other countries in the world. And nationalism also, in terms of the nation building process in Eastern Europe and in also countries like Turkey, we see the influence of ideas which have sprung from the French intellectual tradition. It was also the second largest colonial empire. It had positions in Indochina, in Southeast Asia, in the north of Africa, especially Algeria, and also it has still some overseas departments, overseas territories, which are still kept to this day. But at the end of the Second World War, we see that France lost much of its empire. It lost Indochina and also it lost Algeria. It is still the largest country in Western Europe in terms of geography. but not in terms of population. It has a varied geography and culture, and it has a multi-ethnic population, especially as a result of large-scale migration from North Africa to France. And we also see, especially, that there are some cultural also differences between different regions of France. Here we see a map of France. We see that we see the countries that are bordering the neighboring countries like Spain in the south west. Then we have across the English Channel the United Kingdom. In the north we have Belgium. We have Germany, we have Switzerland on the eastern frontier, we have Italy. So these countries are actually circling the French territory, having, let's say, borders with France. And there is also a tiny country, Luxembourg, which is also just adjoining the French borders in the northeast. So geographically looking, we can say that there are maybe natural borders in the south. The Mediterranean Sea creates, of course, a sea border, and then we have the Pyrenees, the Pyrenees Mountains, again a natural border between Spain and France. In the also in the borders to the in the shores to the Atlantic Ocean, again we have a clear natural boundary. The English Channel also creates a natural boundary, but especially in the north and in the east, we see that the country can be open to both human movement because there are no mountains there, and it's a territory that can be also quite easy to enter or to bypass. However, throughout history we have seen that these particular circumstances, the natural and geographical circumstances, made France become prone to invasion from outside, especially Germanic invasions. When we look at other symbols of France, Jeanne d'Arc again comes to mind. Again, she is a female warrior. When she was just 16 years old, she went to battle against the British during the Hundred Years' War between Britain and France. She played an important role, and she also played an important role in, let's say, in Orleans, in the Battle of Orleans against the British, and she was able to rescue the city from the British. She had an important role in this war. However, she was taken as a prisoner by the British, and then she was later tried, and she was sentenced to death, and she was burned alive in Rouen, in the city of Rouen, and her very short life came to a tragic end. However, later she was, let's say, given the title of a martyr, and she was also given sainthood, and she became a very important symbol of French history. Then another important, let's say, aspect of national identity is the Marseillaise. It is the national anthem of the French, which was adopted in 1795. And when we look at the lyrics, let's say, of the national anthem, we see that it is very strong. There is a lot of blood, a lot of reference to killing, to violence, but this is all in the name of the nation, in the name of the country. So when we look at a part of the lyrics, it says, "To arms, citizens, form your battalions. Let's march, let an impure blood water our furrows." So it is quite violent. There is very strong language, and there is also an attempt to, let's say, mobilize the citizens against the idea of the nation, national unity, and to protect the country from any attack from outside. And also, of course, there are also some other parts of the Marseillaise against tyranny, for example. It also directs the people to rebel against tyrants, to rebel against injustice. It was one of the first national anthems which was propagated by countries in Europe. Again, as I've said, when we look at some of the basic characteristics of the country, we can say it is vulnerable because of the geographic position that we have talked about. It is vulnerable to land attack from the north and the east. Um, because of this maybe apprehension about attacks and also very long wars that the country has seen, that the people has witnessed, importance of having a large army became a very prominent priority for French kings, French monarchs, and also then, of course, during the Republican era as well. So a large army, military power was deemed as very important, both for protecting the country and also for supporting a important global role, an international role for France against other countries to increase its power position. In terms of the culture, we can also talk about the very distinct cultural characteristics, especially between the north and the south of the country. And there are some pockets of different cultures, different dialects being spoken. Corsica, for example, it has its own language, and there have been, although not very violent, but there have been some attempts to, let's say, to separate from France. It has been also home to both a strong absolutist tradition, meaning a monarchist tradition, a centralized power, non-democratic power, and also a republican tradition, which gives importance to the will of the people, the general will of the people. So both of these traditions have existed in France. We have seen from time to time one of these traditions gaining the upper hand, becoming more important in the evolution of the state and historical evolution of the country. We can still see maybe a dilemma, a paradox, and a tension between these different political traditions. In terms of economics, if you remember, we talked about an early industrialization. In the case of Britain, France has been quite a competitor for Britain. They have fought, they have competed in global supremacy. However, comparing their patterns of industrialization, we see the opposite trend in France. France has been a late industrializing country compared to Britain. It has a quite large agricultural sector, and the rural, especially the rural parts of the country, have mostly engaged in agricultural production, and it has a very large cuisine, very varied and very famous cuisine, which also reflects maybe this large agricultural sector. And since the 1970s also, we have witnessed a rapid agricultural modernization. Especially, of course, we have to mention that the common agricultural policy in the European community has helped the modernization of French agriculture. In the economy, again, rather than a liberal tradition where the market takes precedence, we have widespread state ownership in the economy. So the state has a very important role in economic issues, in the management of the economy. During the current era, especially in the 2000s, under Nicolas Sarkozy, the presidency of Nicolas Sarkozy, we have seen efforts to liberalize the economy in France. So France wanted to also maybe catch the train of this neoliberal turn in the world. However, after 2008, when the world economy was shaken by the financial crisis, again we saw that the state again assumed a prominent role in the management of the economy and to protect the country from the unwanted effects of this financial crisis. France is a Catholic country. Catholicism has been very important. Catholicism, Christianity has been very important in the cultural traditions of the country. And today, still the dominant religion in the country is Roman Catholicism, 63%. However, there are also a quite large percentage of the population that say that they are atheists or they are agnostics, etc., that they do not practice or they do not not believe in Roman Catholicism. Again, we also have a quite high percentage of Muslims, especially because of migration from North Africa. About 7.5% according to latest figures. We also have Protestants in France, and during history we have seen bitter struggles with Protestants. There have been attempts by the monarchy to suppress and even massacre, kill the Protestants in France, and some of them had to flee the country in order to save their lives. Still today we have 1.5 million Protestants. There is also a strong anti-clerical movement because of the large-scale privileges of the Catholic Church. There were also some protest movements that criticized the privileges that the Church enjoyed, and a strong anti-clerical movement also emerged. This is mostly against also the clergy, the religious class, let's say, that emerged and that used and enjoyed these privileges. It is also a country which has a secular tradition. There was a secularization process which separated the state from the religion, and which limited the role of religion in state affairs and the political system. There is also a Jewish community, which was, of course, very much purged during the Second World War, especially during the German invasion, during the Nazi invasion of the Second World War. However, even before, even in the 19th century, we see the emergence of a strong anti-Semitic movement. When we talk about anti-Semitism, we mean a movement that criticized Jews, that wanted to eliminate Jews from political and social life, and that thought that maybe the Jews had a lot of power, they were integrated into the system, and they did not really let's say, work to the benefit of the country. So it was like a conspiracy theory, maybe we can say, but they worked against the Jews, and it also took some extreme, let's say, positions like the extermination of Jews from Europe. So we see anti-Semitism in France, especially in the 19th century, and there was an affair which was called as the Dreyfus Affair, which started in 1894 at the end of the 19th century. And here there was an official in the French army who was from Jewish origin, and he was accused of espionage for the Germans against the French army and the French state. Later it was found that actually Dreyfus was not really guilty, and what was behind this accusation, this espionage accusation, was actually anti-Semitism. He was targeted not because he was guilty of espionage, but because he was Jewish, of Jewish origin. In 1898, the famous French writer Émile Zola, wrote a letter in the newspapers, which was an open letter, which was directed to the President of the Republic. So he said, I accuse the President, because he was talking about this affair that an official of the French army was wrongly accused of espionage, and he was imprisoned. His titles were taken away from him. His pride was taken away from him. So he accused the state and the president for engaging in this wrong, let's say, accusation of this military official. And he talked about anti-Semitism. So this letter, this open letter, was also very famous. When we look at the class structure in the country, we can talk about the medieval divisions between the nobility, clergy, townsmen, and the peasants. So there were the peasants that were mostly tied to the land with very few resources. Then we had the townsmen that formed maybe the lower middle classes, that engaged in artisanal activity, small trade, being merchants, etc. They were living in the towns, and they were established maybe this basis of the future bourgeoisie, the bourgeois class. And then we had the clergy that were mostly attached to the Catholic Church, and we also had the nobility. The nobility were the aristocratic classes that were very much linked with the monarchy, but unlike the aristocracy in the British case, these people could not really get major advantages from the monarch. They were mostly under the domination, under the hegemony of the monarch, and they did not really have a role in, let's say, putting some checks and controls over the monarch's power. So they were mostly inferior, in an inferior position to the monarch. In terms of the social structure, we see a quite elitist social structure. For example, we see that even today, most politicians are mostly had an elitist upbringing. They went to certain schools. For example, there is a school called ENA, which is a public administration school, and most of the people who take up positions in bureaucracy and in the political structure are graduates of this school. And recently, also, we are witnessing the growing of an underclass, meaning that people who are in a very precarious position, they maybe have jobs, but they do not really have sufficient income in order to guarantee their living, their future. They are mostly living very precariously. They see that their social benefits are being dwindled, or maybe they do not have very secure jobs. They have jobs and then they lose that job and then they find another job, etc. They change between jobs. Maybe they are unemployed. Some of them are unemployed. Most of them are maybe from migrant origin also. And this creates an underclass which is very critical of the country, of the economics and politics of the country. Now we come to the history of France. Again, we see that the country's native population was called as Ligurians, and then the Celtic tribes came, and there was a mixture maybe between these two, let's say, ethnic backgrounds. So it is populated by Celts and native Ligurians. It also became part of the Roman Empire, so France was part of the Roman Empire, and during the Roman times it was called as Gallia. So if you have read let's say the series, let's say the caricature Asterix, it took place in the Roman era. It was in Gallia, and these people were of Gallian origin. And the Roman Empire had a lasting influence on France. Again, compared to the British case, we see that in the case of Britain, the Roman Empire's influence was more limited, but in France it was longer lasting, let's say. And while, for example, when we look at the English language, we see that it is from the Germanic language family, but when we look at France, we see that it is a Romanic language. It is closer to other Romanic languages like Italian and Spanish. After the collapse of Rome, the country was taken over by Franks, and Franks were a Germanic tribe that later also became Romanized. So they were under the influence of the Roman culture, and they lost some of their Germanic, let's say, identity or Germanic characteristics. And head of the Franks was called Clovis. And this name, Clovis, was the origin of the later name Louis or Louis, which was a name which was frequently used by French kings or monarchs. He was baptized in 496. This is a ritual of Christianity when a child is born in the few, let's say, in the first days after birth. There is a ceremony, a baptism, where the baby becomes part of the church. It is Christianized, sort of. It becomes part of the Christian language, let's say a member of the Christian religion, let's say, and all the sins are forgiven, etc. So it's like a conversion ceremony or an introduction into the religion, Christianity. And France, it is supposed that, or it is assumed that France also became Catholic after the state when the king of the Franks became baptized and assumed the Catholic identity. In 732, there was a Battle of Tours, which was quite important, where Franks, united under Charles Martel, beat the Moors in 732. The Moors were actually the Arabic tribes, the sort of Emevis, let's say, that entered into Spain and ruled over much of Spain and southern Italy also. And this defeat by Charles Martel brought the end of Moors in Europe. Later, the Moors were, let's say, were not able to hang on to their possessions, their territories in Europe. And Charles Martin was seen as the commander of Europe and the, let's say, the savior of Europe because of his defeat of the Moors. And Charles Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, became an emperor and an influential figure of European history, and he founded the Holy Roman Empire in 800. The Holy Roman Empire continued until 18th century. However, of course, it was a very widespread sort of political structure, and it was a very sort of loose and weak centralized power. So at the beginning, it became a symbol of European unity. However, after Charlemagne, the territories of the Holy Roman Empire was mostly divided between his sons. And in the 18th century, the French philosopher Voltaire actually ridiculed the Holy Roman Empire, and he said it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. So it was not holy, it was not Roman, or it was not even an empire. So he mostly was talking about quite weak sort of political structure under the Holy Roman Empire. So here we have a map which shows the geographical extension, let's say, of the Holy Empire during history. So in the first map, we see the Holy Roman Empire at the time of the foundation of the empire. This is like the 10th century. And here we see that Italy, it includes Italy, also the Low Countries like Netherlands, Belgium, also Germany. And then here we have the Holy Roman Empire around the 13th, let's say, century, where it has reached its greatest extent, its greatest borders. And then we have the dissolution in like 1806, the Holy Roman Empire's dwindling territories. And we see that it was a quite influential sort of a political structure in Western Europe. Charlemagne, again, was an important political figure, as we have talked about, and he was an emperor who ruled much of Western Europe, especially during his lifetime between 768 to 814. He became king of the Franks and ruled over present-day Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Western Germany. During his time, there was also a large-scale conversion in the lands that he ruled over to Christianity. After Charlemagne, we see a disintegration into several small kingdoms and dukedoms. So several different kingdoms and principalities also emerged in today's France, and a process of centralization and unification started around the Paris region, which was called as the Ile-de-France, Island of France. So it became the center of the nation building, state building process. We see that this process of centralization and state building that started in the 10th century continued until the 16th century. So we have a process of conquest and annexations, etc. The territory that belonged to the French state widened and increased during this period. Louis the 11th doubled the size of France, weakened the feudal nobles, and in this process, he also established the basis of a strong state structure. He weakened the feudal nobles, so the feudal nobles lost their privileges against the centralization of the monarchy. He ignored the estate general, which meant the, let's say, a representative assembly of the different classes, for example, the townspeople, the bourgeois, the clergy, and the aristocracy. He did not really give them any power. He didn't listen to what they say. He didn't let them, let's say, flourish as a form of political institution. And he, during his time, he also developed a royal bureaucracy, and he was very much intent on taxation, especially from the aristocracy, in order to increase the budgetary powers of his monarchy. Again, during the nation building process in the 17th and 18th centuries, we see the evolution of a centralized royal bureaucracy. So the palace under the monarch also became much more institutionalized, much more efficient because of the development of a bureaucracy. And as we said, because of the also specific nature of France's geography and its also relations with other countries, the wars that has shaken Europe throughout this process, we see also a professional standing army evolved in the meantime. Under Louis XIII, we see Cardinal Richelieu becoming chief minister between 1624 and 1642. And this cardinal also was an important political figure in the historical evolution of France, and he further centralized the state and weakened the feudal lords, the power of the feudal lords. Then we come to an era where we see a very important, again, monarch who was very much interested in centralizing power and also announcing, let's say, his supremacy over all the other groups or the aristocracy, clergy, etc., in the country. And he talked about especially he glorified the existence of his monarchy, and there is a famous expression that he used or that was attributed to this ruler, the French monarch, Louis XIV, and he said, "L'État, c'est moi." So he said, "The state, it is me. I am the state." So we don't look for any other, let's say, organs, any other political power centers, etc. I represent the state and I embody all the powers of the state. So I rule, I make laws, I can punish people, I have all the authority of the state. I hold it in my own hands, in my own personification. And during his reign, policies of war and magnificence were also implemented. So there was an increasing centralization of the state and also increasing continuing bureaucratization. A large army was sustained. During his reign, during Louis XIV's reign, the Versailles Palace was built, which became sort of like a symbol of the magnificence of the French state, French monarchy. And in order to, of course, gain resources for the sustaining of the monarchy, the Versailles Palace, the wars of the country entered into a mercantilist economic policy. So basically filling in the treasury, especially attaining gold reserves in order to sustain the economic power of the state under a mercantilist economic policy. And much of the aristocracy also were made to live in Versailles, and they became like courtiers. They became, let's say, subjects of the king, and they lost their privileges more and more, especially against the growing power of the monarchy. Here we see a picture, a map showing France about in the 11th century, at the beginning of the 11th century. And here we see that a process of centralization is emerging in the let's say starting from Ile-de-France, the Paris region, and here we see the royal domain emerging, the areas which are in orange, in pink. Then we see the fiefs held by um, the aristocracy. We see the ecclesiastical territories and other fiefs under the crown. So we see an emergence of the state building process emerging. And this is another, let's say, picture of France, which shows the regional governments, let's say, the gouvernements. And these also show the different territories like Brittany, Normandy, Maine, the Guinea and Gascony, Marche, etc., Champagne, Picardy, all these. Let's say here in the middle we see Paris, Versailles as the center of this politically centralized domain.